Welcome to our virtual event, Working in the Cold. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Pogorzelek. My background is in pharmacology and microbiology. I'm a certified health and safety consultant and work as a prevention consultant at Safe Work Manitoba.
Hi, Mike. My name is Jennifer Dick. My background is in nursing, and I'm a certified occupational health nurse and prevention consultant with Safe Work Manitoba. Safe Work Manitoba is a division of the Workers' Compensation Board and is a public agency dedicated to the prevention of workplace injury and illness. Working with our partners in the safety community, we provide prevention education, safety programming, consulting, and strategic direction to create a genuine culture of safety for all Manitobans.
We'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. In an effort to ensure we comply with public health protocols, Jen and I are presenting from our own homes. Please use the Q&A box if you have any questions or technical issues during the presentation. We will do our best to respond throughout. If we are unable to give an accurate response right away following this presentation, we will compile all questions, take time to research the answers, and post the responses to our website. The recording of this presentation will be posted at a later date on the Safe Work Manitoba YouTube channel. It is also important to note this presentation provides advice of a general nature. It is not a substitute for legal or health advice and should not be relied on as such. Viewers should seek their own legal and health advice and or follow workplace procedures as appropriate.
Thanks, Mike. We really do have a full agenda today. We tend to talk about the cold in winter and when working outdoors, but there really is more to it, and we want to share that with you today. Today, we're going to talk about thermal stress. We're going to look at what factors to consider when working in the cold. We'll talk about cold-related illnesses and how to prevent them. We'll look over personal and environmental risk factors to be aware of. And finally, we'll go through 9 tips to reduce the risk of cold stress. At the end, we'll leave you with some key takeaways. So let's get started. We know that thermal stress is a physical hazard. When we talk about thermal stress, we are talking about when there's a change in the temperature of the environment. Environments that are hot or cold can lead to thermal stress to the workers. The body's internal temperature should be approximately between 36 and 37 degrees Celsius. And here in Manitoba, I think we can all agree that we typically have cold winters and hot summers. But when we talk about hot and cold environments, it's not just about the outdoors. Depending on the work environment, the body adapts and maintains its temperature so that the employee can function optimally. A body adapts to hot temperatures by sweating. The body adapts to cold environments by shivering or shunting blood away from the extremities to the vital organs.
Thanks, Jen, for the definition. Within the legislation, thermal stress is covered under Part 4 of the Workplace Safety and Health Regulation, General Workplace Requirements, specifically 4.12 and 4.13. Basically, when a workplace or work process exposes a worker to cold conditions that may create a risk to the worker's safety or health, the employer must implement safe work procedures and control measures to ensure that the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists threshold limit values, or ACGIH TLVs, for thermal stress are followed, and the worker is provided with information, instruction, and training in the symptoms of cold stress and the precautions to be taken to avoid injury. 4.13 is an addition to 4.12 and focuses on indoor environments. 4.13 states that an employer must establish and maintain conditions including air temperature, radiant temperature, humidity, and air movement in an indoor workplace that are appropriate to the nature of the work being done. Therefore, both outdoor and indoor environments have to be considered when looking at cold stress. Cold stress can be a serious occupational hazard, and certain occupations may be at more risk compared to others. Some industries or occupations that may be at increased risk include construction, oil and gas, first responders such as firefighters and police, trucking, agriculture, food and manufacturing and processing, shipping and receiving. It is important to know that workers do not need to be exposed to below zero temperatures to experience cold stress. You can experience cold stress in the summer months, for example, if it's raining and windy and you are not dressed for the conditions. In addition, cold stress can be experienced in indoor settings, including freezer rooms or unheated buildings.
There are also a number of injuries that we see from the cold. Our focus today is on the injuries related to exposure. We know that cold can cause a variety of injuries, from frostnip to hypothermia, as well as immersion type injuries where the body or an extremity is immersed in water. We are also going to talk about chilblains. Cold can be a contributing factor to MSIs or musculoskeletal injuries, which we are not going to focus on today, however, want to bring attention to the secondary type hazard. Environment Canada describes frostnip as a mild form of frostbite. This is where only the skin freezes, but the underlying tissues are not impacted. Skin can appear discolored, and the person may also experience a tingling or a burning sensation. Environment Canada goes on to report that rubbing the area or massaging the area is not recommended. The area should be warmed gradually, avoiding direct heat which can harm the skin. The person who has experienced frostnip should also avoid further exposure to the cold once that area has been rewarmed. Frostbite, on the other hand, occurs when tissue freezes. When the temperature falls below 0 degrees Celsius, frostbite can occur. It can lead to scarring, permanent tissue damage, and possible amputation. The person experiencing frostbite can experience a variety of symptoms, which can vary. One of the classic signs that is often seen with frostbite is when the skin appears waxy, and it also may be hard to touch. The person may be experiencing extreme pain or perhaps no pain at all. The suggested process to follow is to avoid rubbing the area and warm the area gradually. It is recommended that the person seek medical help as soon as possible to avoid further injury. The normal internal body temperature of a human is typically 37 degrees or 98.6 Fahrenheit. When someone experiences hypothermia, their temperature passes below 35 degrees Celsius. When someone experiences hypothermia, they may have uncontrollable shivering, drowsiness, loss of motor functioning, discomfort, and really cold skin. The body is trying to shunt all of the blood from the extremities to the vital internal organs. The American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or ACGIH, provides detailed information on cold stress. They indicate that cold, wet, windy weather adds to a greater risk of hypothermia. Hypothermia can rapidly progress to coma and death. If someone is experiencing symptoms of hypothermia, the recommendation is to get medical help immediately. This is a medical emergency. Remove the person from the cold if possible and start to warm them gradually. Wet articles of clothing should be removed to ensure that the person can get warm. By warming the center of the body, the chest, neck, head, and groin will help to warm the individual faster.
The last two cold-related injuries that we will talk about is trench foot and chilblains. Trench foot is caused when the foot is exposed to wet and cold conditions for an extended period of time. If these conditions are allowed to persist, damage to the tissue and nerves can occur. This may result in numbness, tingling, swelling, and pain. In extreme circumstances, this can result in gangrene. Trench foot was a common condition in the First World War, where soldiers had to hunker down for extended periods of time in damp, cold trenches. To prevent trench foot, you want to ensure your socks and footwear are dry and warm. If you're experiencing numbness, pain, and swelling, you want to seek medical attention. Lastly, we have chilblains. Chilblains is a mild injury caused by prolonged exposure to cold air, usually between 0 to 16 degrees Celsius. Signs and symptoms include red or swollen bumps on the extremities, which include the fingers and toes, that may become itchy or painful. To prevent chilblains, you want to keep your extremities warm and dry by wearing winter-approved gloves and footwear. If you're experiencing chilblains, warm the affected area gently and avoid rubbing. Next, we'll get into the 2019 ACGIH TLV and BEIs. The objective of the 2019 ACGIH TLV and BEI publication in relation to cold stress is to protect workers from the most severe effects of cold stress. This includes frostbite and hypothermia, and to prevent the deep core body temperature from falling below 36 degrees Celsius. When assessing the risk of exposure to cold stress, temperature, wind speed, work, and personal factors should be considered. This can be done through a risk management strategy where cold hazards are assessed and control measures are brought in to mitigate the risk of injury. There are many factors that can increase a person's risk to cold injury. These factors are divided into environmental or work-related factors and personal factors. We'll first start off with environment or workplace-related factors. So these include wind chill, which factors in the air temperature and wind speed. Wind chill is the temperature we feel, and when you combine increased wind speeds with cold temperatures, the rate of heat loss increases until ambient temperature is reached. We also have humidity or wetness. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than dry air. Therefore, if you're working in damp clothes in the cold weather, your risk of cold injury dramatically increases. We also have solar load, which is the amount of solar radiation absorbed by an object. This can be used to a worker's advantage in cold weather. For instance, wearing black will absorb more solar radiation than white and will lead to increased temperatures at the surface of the piece of clothing. You also have immersion. Being immersed in water will drive heat away from the body in a much quicker time than dry air. Duration and frequency have to be considered as well, how long you're exposed to the cold and how often, and finally work rates, which is the amount of work activity. High intense work will lead to increased heat production and increased sweating, whereas low intense work will lead to less heat production and make you more susceptible to the cold. Therefore, it's important to dress in layers. You want to remove appropriate layers to prevent sweating in high intensity work situations and add appropriate layers in low intense work situations. So we've talked about work-related factors. Now we're going to move on to personal factors. So some of these, some that fall under this category include gender. So due to gender differences such as body size, weight, and metabolic response, women may be more susceptible to cold than men. We also have age. As we age, metabolism decreases, resulting in decreased heat output. Therefore, older employers or employees may be more susceptible to cold. We have acclimatization, which is the gradual process in which the body becomes accustomed to temperature extremes. It is also important to consider when dealing with cold stress. It is achieved by gradually exposing the worker to cold over a period of time. Eventually, the worker starts to regulate their core temperature in that environment more efficiently. Generally, the employee becomes acclimatized within 4 days or working in cold temperatures. Or if the employee is away from these temperatures for too long, they will have to be reacclimated. Medical concerns, including hypertension, respiratory diseases, diabetes, and heart disease, can make an individual more susceptible to cold stress compared to healthy individuals, and may make acclimatization difficult. In addition, alcohol and certain recreational or prescription drugs can affect heat production and make someone more susceptible to cold stress. Workers that have medical conditions that could affect their cold response should be monitored, and work should be modified to suit their needs. We have clothing. It's important to dress for the conditions and work processes. Ensure you're wearing a sweat-wicking material as your first layer and a windbreak as your final layer. Remember to adjust the number of layers you're wearing to avoid sweating. If your clothes become wet, you want to change into dry clothes. Also, do not forget to protect your hands, ears, face, and head. Finally, we have level of fitness. Generally, an individual who is more fit will be able to maintain a high metabolic rate and therefore higher heat output over a longer period of time versus somebody who is less fit.
Thanks, Mike. We often think about cold as just part of living in Manitoba, but it really is so much more. There's so many factors to consider and occupations that can be impacted. We're now going to move into the 9 tips to keep your workers safe while working in a cold environment. The first tip is all about training leaders and workers on the hazards and signs and symptoms of cold injuries. And we reviewed the signs and symptoms of some cold stress injuries earlier. It is so important to be able to recognize and understand what to look for and what to do. It is also important to make sure we're all aware of our own risk factors. Do you have an autoimmune disease that makes you more susceptible? Have you been acclimatized? These are all questions to consider. It is also important to have safe work procedures. What would this look like? This is a way of communicating a procedure for working in the cold. If you're working in a freezer and start to feel like your reflexes are changing and you feel extremely fatigued, what are you supposed to do? If you're an outdoor worker, at what temperature do you need a warm-up shelter? We often hear about firefighters in the wintertime needing to cycle into a fire suppression emergency. They are working in a cold and wet environment. It's imperative that they are following a safe work procedure to ensure they stay safe while working in the cold. We also want to ensure that workplaces are aware of the first aid needed and any emergency procedures around exposure. Understanding that we should not run hands under hot water if they are cold, as this could cause further injury. Being aware of how to do emergency first aid from exposure. And finally, making sure that there is training around hydration and proper eating while working in the cold. Whether indoors or outdoors, making sure that workers understand that they need to stay hydrated and nourished. Drinking warm beverages, warm soups, etc. This will help to fuel the body and hydrate. Next, I will turn it over to Mike to discuss the buddy system.
As part of our strategy to reduce the risk of exposure to cold stress, employing a buddy system with your coworker or supervisor is a great way to mitigate the risk of cold injury. Pairing up when working in cold helps with timely identification of signs and symptoms of cold stress and ensures first aid is provided when appropriate. Ensure workers are aware of the reporting procedures and actions they need to take when they identify coworkers showing signs and symptoms of cold stress.
Great tip, Mike. The third is to acclimate. Do you recognize in the spring when the temperature is around 1 degree Celsius, we consider this warm, but in the fall, we would consider this temperature cold. This is because our bodies have acclimated to the cold in spring and the heat in the fall. The body needs to adapt to new temperatures and regulate the core temperature within the environment. This can vary among workers and individuals. Acclimating is a gradual process in which the body becomes accustomed to temperature extremes. This is when we're gradually introduced to colder temperatures with greater intensity.
When working in cold environments, workers should be taking scheduled rest breaks and be encouraged to use warm-up shelters as needed, especially as soon as they start showing early signs and symptoms of cold stress. It is important to remember when entering a warm-up shelter, remove layers as appropriate to prevent sweating. When working in cold, it's also important to keep track of the weather, not just for precipitation such as snow or freezing rain, but for wind chill. Wind chill is a factor of ambient temperature and wind speed. Increased wind speed and decreased temperature accelerates heat loss from the body and the colder we feel. When looking at controls, wind chill values will dictate clothing requirements to maintain our core body above 36 degrees Celsius. A good way to estimate the cooling power of wind is to look at the wind chill calculation chart on the next slide. To use this chart, you will need to know the ambient temperature in degrees Celsius and the wind speed in kilometers per hour. For example, if the ambient temperature is minus 35 degrees Celsius and the wind speed is 35 kilometers an hour, the estimated wind chill will be minus 53 degrees Celsius. In this chart, we can also assess the risk of frostbite based on color. Wind chill values highlighted in light blue are low risk for frostbite. However, wind chill values highlighted in purple are extreme, where frostbite can occur within 2 minutes or less of exposure. Using this chart can help you assess the risk of cold stress to workers working in both indoor and outdoor environments.
That's really interesting, Mike. Thank you. It's also really important for workplaces to understand that when working in the cold, whether indoors or outdoors, work rate needs to be considered. Work rate focuses on the intensity of the work or the activity level. This would be the energy required to complete a task. CCOHS talks about the need to manage expectations around work rate, as this should be set at keeping workers warm without causing them to sweat. When we sweat, our clothing gets wet, and that can create an environment for workers to get cold. You can also review the ACGIH TLV booklet for detailed information. It is also important to note that the opposite can be an issue as well. Prolonged standing, sitting, or contact with cold surfaces can also impact our ability to be warm. If you think about a time when you were not moving and standing sedentary, your feet may have gotten cold because you weren't moving them to produce the heat and you were absorbing the cold from the object you were stepping on or leaning against.
Thanks, Jen, for that information. The type and amount of layers of clothing required to keep you comfortable when working in cold environments is dependent on the worker's metabolic rate and wind chill. For example, if the worker is performing sedentary work in cold environments where they are seated or standing in a position for a long period of time, they may require a higher insulation factor and additional layers to keep warm. This may include a down jacket, long sleeve sweater, toque, mitts, and a face mask. However, if they're performing hard work, for instance, carrying 40-pound load, they may require less insulation, such as a light jacket, long sleeve sweater, and gloves. If the work process involves increased hand dexterity, gloves may be required. Mitts have a higher insulation factor compared to gloves, however, they provide less dexterity. If workers will be working in cold environments where gloves are required, increased warm-up periods or breaks should be considered. Remember, it's important to wear a base layer that will wick away sweat and to dress in layers to adjust your insulation value based on the working conditions. Ensure your clothing is not too tight, as this can restrict blood flow and decrease your body's heat production. More information on clothing requirements can be found in the ACGIH booklet, Cold Stress section, specifically Table 2, which can be used to determine work rate, which includes sedentary, easy work, moderate work, or hard work, and Figure 3, which can be used to determine the insulation requirement based on the temperature and the work rate.
Thank you, Mike. I always find it interesting to hear about the importance of clothing and how best to dress for working in the cold, be it indoors or outdoors. Our next tip is around PPE, or personal protective equipment. When we talk about working in the cold, it's not only important to dress for the temperatures, but also to ensure that we are still maintaining the appropriate PPE protocols for our workplaces. If your workplace has PPE standards in place, please ensure you follow these measures. This can include the use of boots that are CSA approved but also provide warmth, high visibility jackets, hard hats, hand protection, and eye protection are other forms of PPE that your workplace may or may not use. In addition, the legislation provides the following information. An employer required to provide a worker with protective headwear must also provide the worker with a liner for that headwear, if it is necessary to protect the worker from cold conditions. They must also provide a worker with a retention system to secure the protective headwear firmly to the worker's head if the worker is likely to work in conditions that may cause the headwear to dislodge. Consideration should be given to PPE and making sure that it fits either over the layers and it is also still being used as needed, making sure that safety is being followed while maintaining its warmth. If you are working outdoors in the snow on a sunny day, UV protective goggles may be an option for you to prevent you from having challenges with seeing.
For a final tip to mitigate the risk of cold stress, it's recommended that your workplace develop and implement a thermal stress prevention program. Though this is not a requirement of the legislation, it is a best practice that will help mitigate the risk of your workforce being exposed to cold stress. The following factors should be considered when implementing a thermal stress prevention program. Medical surveillance. If the outside temperature falls below -1 degree Celsius, workers with medical conditions such as heart disease or diabetes, or workers taking prescription drugs that affect heat production may be at risk of cold stress. These workers should be restricted from working in these types of conditions and be given modified work. Training is also important. Training should focus on the hazards of cold stress and how to safely work in cold environments. This includes training on first aid measures, clothing requirements, warming techniques, safe work procedures, and recognizing signs and symptoms of cold stress and cold injury. Personal hygiene and health are also important. Staying healthy and physically fit helps your body adapt to cold conditions. And reporting procedures. It's important that the workers report to their supervisor if they notice themselves or coworkers showing signs and symptoms of cold stress. Additional information or factors that you should consider for indoor environments are refrigerator rooms should have an air velocity decreased to 1 meter per second, and workers should wear special wind protective clothing to minimize exposure. For outdoor environments, you want to reduce cold exposure limits when workers are exposed to toxic substances and vibration, as these can exacerbate the effects of cold, specifically thermal regulation and circulation can be impacted. If workers will be exposed to glare off ice or snow, consider wearing eye protection, such as special safety goggles with UV protection. If eye protection is not worn, temporary conjunctivitis or temporary loss of vision can occur. In addition, blowing ice crystals can create a hazard for the eyes. Workplace monitoring should be considered as part of the thermal stress program. For more information, you want to consult the ACGIH's thermal stress section in the 2019 TLVs and BEI publication to determine the specifics for your workplace. The CSA standard Z101018, titled Management of Work in Extreme Conditions, is also a great resource to help you develop a thermal stress prevention program.
Those are some great tips, Mike. To begin to wrap up this webinar on staying safe in the cold, we want to leave you with some key takeaways. These takeaways are important, but it's also important to make sure that the control measures are enforced and behavior is modified. Here are some of our top takeaways. Listen to the weather forecast. Listen for extreme cold warnings and watches and wind chill factors, following credible sources. Plan ahead. Have a cold weather safety plan and reduce the amount of time spent outdoors if the weather is extreme. If working indoors, make sure you know where the exit is and where to go to warm up. Dress warmly. Dress in layers, for example, the first layer of a wicking material and the outer layer as wind resistant. Wear a hat, mitt, or gloves and face mask. Cover as much skin as possible when under extreme cold conditions. Seek shelter. Get out of the wind and spend less time outdoors in extreme conditions. Stay dry. Add or remove layers as needed to prevent sweating. Keep active. Activity will help generate body heat and keep you warm. And finally, be aware. Watch for signs of frostnip, frostbite, and hypothermia.
Here at SafeWork, we have an acronym SAFE. Spot the hazard, assess the risk, find a safer way every day. To spot the hazard, it's important to recognize the signs and symptoms of cold stress and cold injury. This includes frostnip, frostbite, hypothermia, trench foot, and chilblains. You want to assess the risk by considering the factors that influence the level of cold stress. These include environmental or workplace factors such as wind chill, humidity, solar load, immersion, duration and frequency of work, and work rates. You also want to include or look at personal factors such as gender, age, acclimatization, medical concerns, and level of fitness. You want to find a safer way, so you want to train workers on how to recognize signs and symptoms of cold stress, including the actions and reporting procedures they need to follow when signs and symptoms of cold stress have been identified. And finally, every day, continue to evaluate your program to make sure it is working and ensure workers understand their roles and responsibilities.
Thanks, Mike. There are many resources available that we consulted as well as used to develop this webinar. They are on the screen: CCOHS, Health Canada, Environment Canada, SafeWork Manitoba, and Workplace Safety of the North.
So that concludes our presentation on working in the cold. As we have heard today, safety and health is a responsibility of everyone in the workplace. If we all work together, we can mitigate the risk of cold injury in our workplaces. If you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to connect with Jen or I.
On behalf of SafeWork Manitoba, thank you for watching our virtual presentation. We hope you are able to take away some tools and knowledge to better understand the factors related to working in the cold. We hope this will help to keep you, your coworkers, and your customers safe. In the coming days, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey. You will also be able to view the complete recording of this webinar and share it with your colleagues. Please be sure to visit safemanitoba.com to view resources and to learn even more about keeping yourself and your workplace safe and healthy when working in the cold, be it indoors or outdoors. Thank you.